There exists a forum beyond that which is known to man. A place that sits between truth and the lies which we choose to believe. A dimension ruled by the shadowy depths of human nature and those who turn a blind eye to it. Submitted for your approval. NoSleep. I've stolen memories from hundreds of people. Within a minute, the memory had been wiped from his troubled mind. It hardly took any effort from my side, but the results were immediate. I could visibly see the look of ease wash over his pained face as the heavy weight of remembering was taken off his shoulders. I, on the other hand, felt shivers surge down my spine as the events unfolded in the back of my mind. The memory of his childhood abuse, the broken bones and bruises, an image forming in my mind's eye as if it had happened to myself. He'd finally opened up about his deepest, darkest secrets, and as a result, his memory had become my own. "How do you feel, Mr. Morrison?" I asked. I feel great, Doctor. I feel free," he said, shocked, confused, but more than anything, relieved. James Morrison, one of my many patients suffering from some kind of horrific event that happened long in the past, plaguing him for each day of every year, always lingering in the back of his mind, preventing him from experiencing life for all of its beauty. It was only after years, if not decades, of his wife pestering him to seek help before he finally agreed to meet with me, and in only a few sessions, I'd essentially cured him. That's what I do, and what I've been doing for the past 20-something years. I'm a psychiatrist with the bizarre ability to steal people's memories. Traumatic events, be it abuse, accidents, or other kinds of psychological or physical violence. Depending on how thorough I am, they may or may not retain knowledge of the event itself, but the emotion behind it is always removed. What they saw, how they felt, how it affected them, those are the parts that trouble people, what haunts them for years after the fact. Once I'm done with them, they'll have a basic understanding about what happened during that time, but it'll be morphed into distant recollection, as if it happened to someone else. It doesn't minimize what they experienced or make it less important, but it helps them deal with the past and continue to live life more or less free of the horrors they had to go through. Of course, I wish I could simply extract and erase the memories, but what I've learned during my life is that the truth can never be removed entirely. Whatever I steal from my clients, be it the whole event or just the pain, it sticks with me, lingering inside my head. Through the stolen memories, I've seen children who were witness to murder. I've seen people raped, teenagers bullied to the brink of suicide, abuse, violent acts, war, and horrible accidents. Whatever the case may be, my treatment requires that the events are isolated enough for me to extract them. Single occurrences are the easiest, but even if they are confined to months or even years, it's also an option, though it requires more time and work on my end. No one knows about my ability. Even my clients don't understand how I work, and they're all the better for it. To the rest of the world, I'm nothing more than a regular, albeit successful psychiatrist. I don't even know how I got this curse, but I vividly remember the first time I unintentionally used it to steal my best friend's happiness. We were kids, 11 years of age, and spending the better part of the summer together. My best friend Neal and I were working on a treehouse, and as he often did, he was bragging about his family's wealth and their crazy adventures. I'll admit, I was envious that he kept getting all the things he asked for, simply having to point and receive, while my own parents struggled to make ends meet. Pets, video games, and fancy holidays to sandy beaches, all the things a kid could ask for. Nonetheless, we were like brothers, and I would never have dreamed of hurting him intentionally. Alas, reality sometimes strikes down and there's nothing you can do about it. When Neal bragged about his wealth and told stories of expensive trips and crazy toys he'd just bought, I felt like I was there. His stories were vivid beyond what my imagination could have conjured, and I felt his joy with each spoken word. Throughout the holiday, he seemed less and less joyful, as if his excitement had been taken from him. It was only when I brought up some of his own stories he told me when I realized he'd quickly started to forget all of the things that made him happy. The summer ended quickly, and the once lively boy had turned into a quiet husk of his former self. Everything that made him excited about life had been erased and put into my own head. And while the positive emotions existed within me, it was a conflicting feeling of guilt. Even though I wasn't the brightest 12-year-old in the world, I quickly realized I was the culprit behind Neal's sudden change. Neal never really found his way back from that summer. At the time, I didn't understand the importance of joyful memories, and as often happens, we simply drifted apart. It would only be years later that I found out that he'd killed himself at the age of 15 following a tough, lengthy battle with depression. By then, I'd gotten a firm grasp of my cursed powers, and the news of his death hit me like a freight train. I decided then and there that I'd spend the rest of my life making up for Neal's suffering, and that's what set me on a path to become a psychiatrist. For the next 20-odd years, I studied, graduated, and started working. Though most of my patients were treated as normal, using what I'd learned throughout my studies, some fit perfectly with my curse. With it, as they finally opened up, I could simply wander into their memory and snatch away what made them suffer. It came at a great personal cost, causing me sleepless nights and multiple flashbacks, but what was my own life worth against the hundreds I could help? Those memories, as vivid as they were, didn't belong to me, which I took comfort in, but the sole knowledge that the images I saw weren't mine wasn't enough. At times, unless I kept myself distracted, the emotions break through and I found myself only inches away from falling apart. That was my life, and until recently, I thought it would last until the end of my days. Then I met Clifford. He came to my office for the first time during November, accompanied by a legal guardian dressed in an expensive suit. He didn't strike me as a particularly special case the first time I met him, a scrawly man in his late 60s holding on to some half-repressed drama. A mentally scarring accident that had happened years ago back when mental health was a taboo topic. Honestly, I always enjoyed the elderly patients. They'd suffered for so long, often ashamed by their pasts. They were people who grew up in a generation where mental health wasn't as important as physical health, and it warmed my heart to see people finally accept that diseases affecting their psyche were as real as any other sickness. But Clifford was no ordinary case, a fact that I learned during our very first session. I received a very peculiar set of instructions, not from Mr. Clifford himself, but rather his guardian. I was told that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which had left Mr. Clifford mute. My job, as strange as it might sound, would be to tell him success stories about people overcoming any kind of mental distress. Despite my advice that there were more scientifically proven treatment methods, he insisted that I just stick to the rules and that I'd be compensated generously for my effort. After some consideration, I came to the conclusion that I couldn't really cause any harm, so I sat down with Mr. Clifford and told him stories. Though not directly taken from prior patients, I have to admit that they were inspired by my previous cases, as my imagination could only go so far. While we spoke, Mr. Clifford showed no outward signs of distress. He simply sat and listened as I talked. I tried carefully encouraging him to speak, but there wasn't anything physically wrong with him. The aphasia stemmed from purely the psychological trauma, or so his caretaker said. I wanted to help him, I truly did, but with these restrictions and inability to take his memories, I could do little but follow orders. That's how our meetings went on for the next couple of months. Mr. Clifford would sit in the chair, nodding along to my stories, never uttering a single word. Though I hardly believed that there was any hope with the chosen therapy, he kept returning, and I kept getting paid. Only once we'd completed our 10th sessions did I notice something odd. Not about the patient himself, but with me. I'd stayed behind after hours trying to finalize some patient files before they were discharged. We only had a single person on the inpatient ward who'd had their memory removed, and I'd only kept him there for observation. I picked up his file and read the name James Morrison. He'd suffered from depression and severe anxiety for the better part of his life following a few years of childhood abuse. Now, after I'd managed to clean out most of his memory over the course of a month, he was almost ready to go home. I read over the case once, then twice, and realized that despite my best efforts, I couldn't remember the stories he'd told me. I knew we'd had sessions together, and I knew about his issues, but the memory itself was simply missing. After frantically reading over his history, I picked up another patient file. Lisa Robertson, again a person whose memory I had removed and stuffed deep into the back of my own, yet I didn't remember any of it. Though the knowledge of them as patients still remained alongside parts of our sessions, I couldn't remember what kind of trauma they'd gone through, what ailed them. With little consideration, my instinct and uncanny gut feeling told me that the fault lay with Mr. Clifford. Luckily, he'd be my last session for the day. He came in early and patiently waited in the lobby while I finished my sessions. He sat down before me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his facial expression changed ever so slightly. He looked worried. It only lasted for the briefest of moments before his casual facade returned. Despite the short duration, and with the implication that he wasn't who he appeared to be, I felt on edge. After all, he was mute, which meant I didn't have to bother with drawn-out small talk and greetings. With him, I got straight to the point. If anyone could keep a secret, it would be someone incapable of talking. Mr. Clifford, something rather bizarre happened to me last night. I can't exactly explain it, but for whatever reason, I feel like our sessions have something to do with it. His worried expression returned for a brief moment once more, and I instantly knew he felt threatened. I think it might be better if we transfer you to a different therapist. I know some truly great ones but before I could finish that sentence, he stood straight up from his chair and just stared at me. Mr. Clifford, what are you doing? I slowly tried to get to my own feet, but they wouldn't budge. Something about Mr. Clifford's intense stare kept me solidly locked in my chair. Then he walked towards me step by step as I felt my consciousness drain away, fading to black before I could even call out for help. I'm not sure how he did it, nor how he snuck my unconscious body out without anyone's knowledge, but once I finally woke back up, I found myself bound to a chair in a dark room. As my eyes adjusted to their dim surroundings, I felt my head pounding with the worst migraine I'd ever experienced. I was in a large, windowless room surrounded by moldy, damp walls on all sides. No furniture save for the chair I was handcuffed to and a light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The only exit was through a rusty metal door, and it was blocked by Mr. Clifford himself, who just stood there, staring at me just as he had before I passed out. Mr. Clifford, what are you doing? Where am I? I asked nervously. Please, Harold, just let me out of here. He approached me, never letting his gaze drift away from my eyes. I pulled on the handcuffs, making them dig into my skin, tearing it apart as blood started to trickle down onto the chair. Wait, what are you? I was cut off as an intense pain shot through the back of my head, pounding away until I couldn't even speak. In the midst of my agony, I started seeing twisted images, plunging what was left of my sanity into darkness. Mr. Clifford had gotten a grip around the most vile, heartbreaking memories I had stolen, and he kept pulling them out from the back of my mind, forcing me to live through them as if they were happening then and there. Stop it, please, just stop it, I screamed in a mixture of pain and horror, but he refused to relent. Within the boundaries of my own mind, I was forced to witness the abuse of a young child, beaten with a belt for dropping a vase. Each slap hitting my back firmly felt as if it were real. A second passed, and the scene changed to that of a war zone. Sweat trickling down my back as I frantically tried to pull a wounded friend out of the line of fire. The hot landscape around me a mess of smoke and noise, disorientating me away from safety as a bullet tore through my thigh, shattering the bone into a million tiny fragments. Then I drowned, deep in the dark abyss of the ocean, a hand reaching out, unable to help me before my vision faded, not returning as my ribs cracked under the chest compressions of a stranger. Every now and then, between the horrors I had been forced to endure, I got a glimpse of Mr. Clifford standing before me, his emotionless face just staring deep into my agonized eyes, torturing me for what felt like hours before finally letting go. The rare moments he left the room were the worst. In the exhaustion, I had fallen too weak to separate truth from reality. I kept waiting for the next horrific event, but they all blended together, making time itself feel like a meaningless stream of chaos. Once he returned, reality started twisting again. Among the nightmares, I could get a glimpse of Neal, his pleasant memories I had held onto since I was a mere boy. Alas, as soon as Mr. Clifford accidentally delved into something nice, he immediately retracted back out, shoving me further into the pain. Voices started filling my head, a symphony of pleas and screams. I couldn't even tell them apart. Were they mine, or were they memories I had stolen? Dad, it hurts. I'm sorry. Please, I mumbled to myself, stuck in another memory. Am I going to die? I asked as I bled profusely from a knife wound in my abdomen. Memories, hundreds of them, shattered into meaningless pieces, serving as little more than torture devices. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Mr. Clifford jolted me back to reality for a moment, and I felt the scruff of a beard that had been growing on my chin over the course of a week. An intravenous line had been inserted into my arm, keeping me hydrated and probably sedated. Why are you doing this? Why don't you just kill me and get it over with? I cried. It was the clearest moment I'd had in a week, and I could think of nothing other than begging for death. I prepared myself as best I could for the next round of mind warping, except instead of the pain I'd come to know so well over the past week, I was just flung into darkness as Mr. Clifford knocked me unconscious. As I floated weightless in the void of emptiness, I couldn't cling to any memories, good or bad. I simply existed in peace, wondering if I had finally succumbed to the mental wounds. Despite the implications of a dark, empty hole, whether I lived or died, I just couldn't have cared any less. For the first time in decades, since I started stealing, I felt happy. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. It all turned hazy once I was dragged back from the void. I remember waking up on the street with paramedics carrying me into an ambulance and the following stay at the hospital. Naturally, they wanted to know where I'd gone, who'd taken me, and what they did to me, but I honestly couldn't tell them. Due to the trauma, I suffered from retrograde amnesia, and I would take the better part of a month to even regain most of my memories, including my own name and age. Mr. Clifford's very existence became nothing more than a vague idea, and with no official documentation that could confirm his identity and the fake name he'd used at the clinic, little could be done to find him. I don't know what exactly happened next. My next and only memory for the next week include awaking in the hospital after being in a coma for a couple of days. The doctors told me I'd been found unconscious on the street and proceeded to ask me what had happened, but I couldn't tell them. The trauma had caused retrograde amnesia. As I healed and started remembering things, I realized a heavy burden had been lifted off my shoulders. While I could remember some of the flashes, they were mere ideas that didn't linger as an unpleasant emotion. I felt at ease, which sped up my recovery significantly, allowing me to return to work. Even more, when I got back to my office, I looked over the patient files. I discovered that each and every memory I had stolen were missing. No more nightmares, no more uncontrollable bursts of emotion when I had time to think. Through Mr. Clifford, I had been given a second chance. I entered my office to greet my first patient for the day, and who stood there none other than Mr. Clifford's personal caretaker. I froze in the door, ready to run to the reception and call the police. "Wait, I don't want to harm you," he yelled. He sounded genuine enough for me to stop, but I kept one foot out the door. "Where's Mr. Clifford?" "He's resting," the man said calmly. "What he did to you, well, it takes a toll." "Why me? Why keep me in that room? It was the only way. You weren't open. You kept your memories hidden like a dark secret. You have a gift, and unless you learn to control it, you'll always suffer the way you keep going." I took a step in and closed the door, still not willing to let anyone know about my curse. "I do it to help people, as do we, but we don't light ourselves on fire just to keep others warm. While you were a particularly hard case, we usually go about things smoother." "Who are you?" "It doesn't matter, but if you ever wish to expand your gift, we're willing to help," he said as he handed me a card containing a website link that consisted of a string of numbers. "I've been given a new chance, an opportunity to help myself, which of course meant I'd have to leave my job. Whatever happens next, I have a tough choice ahead of me."